What if Alexander the Great lived? Picture Babylon at night. Torches flicker against palace walls. The most famous 20-something in the world lies burning with fever. In our timeline, he dies at 32, and the empire he carved from the Mediterranean to India breaks like glass. But not here. In this version, he survives. He opens his eyes, breathes, and the map of the world begins to rewrite itself. Let's ground ourselves. In real history, Alexander smashed the Persian Empire, marched to the Indus, founded cities, and tried something radical, merging Macedonian and Persian elites into a single ruling class. Then suddenly, Babylon, 323 BCE. He dies. His generals, the Diadochi, divide everything. Ptolemies take Egypt, Seleucids take Asia, Antigonids hold Macedon. Greek culture spreads, yes. Philosophy in Alexandria, trade across deserts and seas, but there's no single center to keep it stable. And into that vacuum, centuries later, Rome rises, unites the Mediterranean, and becomes the spine of European identity. So, what if the fever breaks differently? Alexander recovers. He's not immortal. He's mortal with time. Time enough to finish what he started, planning, not just conquering. He had a to-do list. He wanted Arabia, a canal between the Nile and the Red Sea, a massive fleet, a capital that was not Macedonian, not Persian, but something new. He wanted his empire to be a cosmopolis. In this alternate path, he wakes and does the boring, brilliant work. First, succession. He doesn't leave an infant to inherit an earthquake. He elevates his trusted half-brother as a ceremonial co-king and sets a clear line for any son to follow, under a council that mixes Macedonian marshals with Persian administrators. He pushes marriage alliances further, not just as show, but as policy. He makes it expensive to defect and attractive to belong. Phase 1, Arabia. Alexander loves decisive lines, and the Red Sea is a line worth owning. He orders shipyards expanded in Phoenicia, Cyprus, and at a new naval arsenal near Alexandria. He funds pilots who know the reefs and winds, and he appoints Nearchus to do what he does best: map coasts, secure harbors, and connect the dots. Arabia folds in piece by piece, ports turned, oases held, tribes paid and sworn. The pilgrimage routes become imperial roads. The Red Sea becomes an imperial lake. With that comes the old idea with new muscle: a canal. The ancients toyed with it. In this world, Alexander makes it policy. A Nile to Red Sea canal doesn't have to be perfect to matter. Even a partial waterway with portage creates a shortcut that binds Egypt to the Indian Ocean. You can feel the commerce move: pepper, cinnamon, pearls, silk, glass. The empire's bloodstream runs along water. While the ships are cutting wakes in the Red Sea, Alexander is cutting marble and law. He standardizes coinage, Attic weight as imperial habit. He sets up a clear tax ladder. He strengthens the royal road across Persia and lays a new one straight from Alexandria through the Levant to Babylon. Stone, way stations, couriers. It is faster to move a letter from Memphis to Susa than to settle a feud in a local court. Speed is a kind of power. The emotional core here is simple. For the first time, the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean aren't two worlds. They're one system. And once you connect systems, everything changes. Religion, science, food, even the stories mothers tell their children. Phase 2, the West calls. Why would Alexander look at the Western Sea? Because anyone who has ever stood in Tyre and watched the ships already knows the answer. Carthage, Phoenician cousins, rich and proud, master traders, masters of the Western Mediterranean. Threat, rival, partner. Alexander learned at Tyre that a city at sea can choke a continent. He will never let an enemy hold that throat again. He builds a navy not just for amphibious drops, but for blue water. Tens of thousands of oars drilled to a drum. Merchant hulls converted to carriers. Siege engineers draw a causeway on a wax tablet and grin. The plan feels familiar because it is. Meet Carthage not on one wall, but on all of them: politics, ports, and pressure. He lands in Sicily first, because grain is the hinge of empire. Syracuse reads the room and chooses the winning team. With Sicily secured, the western gate loosens. Carthage has options, fight or bargain. And to the shock of some war councils, Alexander does both. He doesn't need to raise Carthage to rule it. He needs Carthage's navy and money pointed in the same direction as his own. So Carthage becomes the proudest vassal in history. Autonomy in trade, guarantees for their oligarchs, a slice of imperial prestige. In exchange, ships, shipwrights, and a promise not to meddle with Greek cities again. The Pillars of Heracles, Gibraltar, become toll booths with Macedonian garrisons perched like hawks. Now the camera pans to Italy. Rome is still Rome, stubborn, organizing, dangerous, but not yet the juggernaut of textbooks. They are grinding through the Samnite wars, hammering out their legions in pain and practice. South of them, Greek cities, Tarentum, Neapolis, are nervous, as always. In our world, they'll someday call for Pyrrhus and his famous victories that feel like losses. In this world, they call a different name. Alexander sails north from Sicily, and the air feels electric. He doesn't rush into the hills and pretend phalanxes are invincible everywhere. He has learned. He combines cataphract cavalry from Iran, light infantry from Anatolia, and phalanx only where the ground says yes. He uses sailors as marines to cut supply lines along the coast. He writes letters to Latin towns promising protection, coin, and the right to keep their gods. Rome meets him where the terrain allows Roman genius, a river line, a defensive ridge, and for a day, iron crushes iron. But wars don't end on one field. They end when one side can no longer pay for the food. Alexander owns Sicily's grain. He owns the sea lanes. He owns the diplomacy of fear and opportunity. The result isn't the smoking crater of a city. It's a treaty, brutal and cold. Rome keeps her walls, keeps her pride, loses her reach. No expansion south. Hostages to guarantee peace. Trade passes through imperial ports. The Roman story becomes local for a century. Stop and feel the ripple. No Rome to swallow the Mediterranean. No Latin as the backbone language from Spain to Syria. Instead, a single shared tongue continues to knit the coasts, a simplified, practical Greek, koine, taught in schools from Egypt to Sicily, from Cyrenaica to Tyre. It's the language of contracts, love letters, and astronomy. Words travel faster than armies, and Greek becomes a highway. Meanwhile, Alexandria, already a jewel in our timeline, becomes something else entirely. Alexander pours treasure into the mauryan and library not as ornaments, but as infrastructure. He doesn't just fund scholars, he pays copyists, map makers, instrument builders. He orders catalogs of flora and fauna across provinces, commands star charts from Babylonian traditions to be reconciled with Greek geometry, and tempts artisans to scale their clever toys into tools. Water screws irrigate fields without a priest's permission. Grain silos are standardized. Lighthouses, plural, ring the sea. Here's the shocker. With a single political center holding for decades under one prestige dynasty, science stops being fragile. In our world, scholarship kept moving but often dodged spears and fires. In this world, it has a bodyguard. Now pivot east because this empire has two horizons. In our timeline, Seleucus traded with Chandragupta Maurya, elephants and territory for peace. If Alexander lives, he takes that negotiation personally and early. He's not stupid. The Ganges Plain is a nightmare for phalanxes. So he does what he's been quietly brilliant at. He federates. He recognizes the Mauryan emperor as an equal beyond a clear frontier. Between them, an artery. Bactria to the Indus. Tax farms replaced by royal auditors. Caravanserai every 20 miles. Policing by mixed detachments. Greek settlers marry local families. Buddhist monks appear in Alexandria sooner than you expect. A Greek sculptor carves a serene human Buddha 100 years early, and a philosopher in Memphis writes a scroll comparing the Buddha's eightfold path to the ethics of Aristotle. Trade tightens. Monsoon winds are no longer mysteries told by sailors in taverns. They are graphed on papyrus and taught to pilots. Ships leave Aden on schedules. Pepper prices fall. When prices stabilize, risk does too, and investment blooms. You don't have to invent engines to move history. Sometimes you just need a ledger and a lighthouse. Around this point, you might be thinking, does a continental empire really hold that long? Don't the cracks always show? They do. But policy can slow the earthquake. Alexander has time to build an aristocracy loyal to the idea of empire, not just to his personality. He creates a council of satraps and cities that meets yearly in Alexandria, a stage and a pressure valve. Disputes can be performed and resolved in view of the king, and everyone leaves with a ribbon and a subsidy. It looks ceremonial. It works political. Mid-roll moment. Quick thought experiment for you. Do you think Alexander would crush Rome outright, or tame it as a client? Which scenario feels more plausible to you and why? Drop your take in the comments. And if you love deep dives like this, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next alternate turning point. Back to the long horizon. Without Rome's empire, Latin remains a regional power language, not an imperial bloodstream. Celtic polities in Gaul evolve under a steady Greek shadow. Market towns sprout Greek-style stoas. Druidic traditions rub shoulders with Stoic ethics. Mercenaries go east and come back with new gods and new armor. In Iberia, Carthaginian merchants, now imperial partners, stitch mining districts to coastal emporia. The western half of Europe doesn't go dark. It goes different, webs of city-states linked more by contracts than by legions. On the northern frontier, the empire learns a lesson Rome later learned the hard way. Walls are maps written in stone. The Caucasus gates, the legendary Caspian passes, get real fortresses with real logistics. Along the Danube, instead of a single militarized frontier, you see layered buffers. Allied tribes with tax exemptions, river flotillas, and Greek market towns served by veteran colonies. Raids never stop, but they stop being existential. And technology? We shouldn't claim steam engines chug across the Peloponnese in 250 BCE. That's fantasy. But institutional curiosity can compound like interest. With stable ports and stipends, hydraulics improve faster. Grain mills appear on streams and spread. Surveying instruments get precise. The Antikythera-like devices that in our world end up in a shipwreck become prized objects at royal courts, teaching future navigators how to predict eclipses. With better maps and compasses, someone hugs the African coast farther than before, tests currents, and maybe, just maybe, rounds the Southern Horn well before the Common Era. Even if they don't, the idea that the world can be measured becomes common. Religion flows differently through this web. In a coin-speaking world with teachers, councils, and tolerant syncretism baked into law, new movements don't slam against a single imperial cult. They mingle. When Judaism debates in Alexandria's lecture halls, when Persian fire temples glow under imperial license, when Buddhist monks share tea with Stoics in coastal cities, later prophets will meet an audience that is curious and organized. The outcome isn't necessarily peace, it's complexity. Mass movements will still surge. They will just surge along roads funded by a library. And when Alexander finally dies, 50 years older, with 2 generations of princes watching, the empire doesn't shatter like glass. It creaks like an old ship and then refits itself. A formalized split? Possibly. Egypt-centered and Asia-centered halves under cousin dynasties who still meet at the council, still use the same coin, still let merchants cross borders with stamped tablets. Think of it as a commonwealth, with occasional civil wars that end in settlements rather than apocalypses. Centuries later, the consequences echo. Without a monolithic Rome to collapse, there is no single fall to cast a long shadow called the Dark Ages over Europe. There are recessions and plagues and border crises, but also a continuity of schools, archives, and engineering manuals. Monastic scriptoria still appear, but so do urban academies, funded by merchant guilds with contracts enforceable from Syracuse to Sidon. The Renaissance as we know it might not burst out of Italy in the 1400s, because pieces of it never died. It smolders continuously in Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamon, and Syracuse, throwing off sparks, perspective in art, advances in anatomy, new gadgets for ships, whenever money and ambition meet. Does that mean the Atlantic stays quiet? Possibly, for a time. A united or federated Mediterranean that already drinks from the Indian Ocean may feel less pressure to gamble on the Western Sea. The Americas could remain unknown to Afro-Eurasia longer, or be stumbled upon by a fishing fleet from Gades blown far off course, opening contact under very different masters. If that happens, the first great colonizers might fly the combined emblems of Carthage and Macedon, not the standards of Castile and Portugal. Imagine temples to Serapis on Caribbean coasts, Greek Phoenician scripts painted on sails, scholars in Alexandria arguing about strange stars seen from a Western archipelago. There are limits. Geography still rules. Steppe empires rise and push. Climate shifts upset harvests. Ambitious princes exist in every century. But Alexander's survival doesn't magic away chaos. It organizes it. It takes what history already showed us, a talent for logistics, for theater, for mixing peoples, and gives it decades to institutionalize. Listen to the quieter changes. A farmer in Sicily learns to read numbers to track his grain because the tax office demands it. His granddaughter becomes a scribe. A sailor from Tyre maps a shoal with a device invented by a craftsman who never starved because the academy paid him on time. A teacher in Bactria runs a school where children recite Homer and a Buddhist sutra on alternate mornings, not as enemies but as neighbors. These are small revolutions multiplied across centuries. And Rome never disappears. The city endures, proud, adaptable, prickly. Latin literature blossoms in a different direction, less imperial, more civic. Romans argue in the Forum about whether Greek theater ruins morals, then write their own plays anyway. They serve in imperial armies, command provincial posts, and grumble about taxes, as people always do. They are not the masters of the Mediterranean, but they are not its slaves either. They are one bright star in a crowded sky. The biggest surprise is how familiar this alternate world feels. It's not utopia. It's politics. It's compromise. It's an empire that learns to use treaties as often as sieges, to pay for peace where blood is too expensive, to build lighthouses instead of legends and let legends follow later. And because the sea lanes stay safe, because the archives stay open, because the great machine of exchange keeps humming, people dare to plan. Plans are where the future hides. All of it. Because a man didn't die one night in Babylon. Because a fever broke. Because time, just time, was granted to ambition. History can hinge on a sword stroke. Sometimes it hinges on a pulse. So ask yourself, if our world is the child of a sudden death, what other worlds are sleeping inside moments we barely notice? What maps are folded inside the seconds we survive? In the end, the lesson is humility. We live under the weather of decisions and accidents made long before we were born. Change one, and the wind shifts. The ships sail to different harbors. The words in our mouths might not be the same. And yet, across those differences, we can still see the human pattern. Fear, hunger, curiosity, love, reaching for the next shore. That's the wonder and the terror of alternate history. It reminds us how fragile the bridge really is, and how miraculous it is that we've crossed it at all.